Weight Watchers now offers access to affordable GLP-1s. It works for members like,
I'm Haley, and I've lost 100 pounds. Weight Watchers has everything I need, from weight loss medications to nutrition support and help with my side effects. It's all in one place.
Weight Watchers handles the insurance for you and offers affordable cash pay options. With our program, our members are losing more weight with expert nutrition and side effect support.
I'm Mike, and I've lost 135 pounds. Weight Watchers prescribing GLP-1 medications. It's been life-changing.
I'm Sharia, and I lost 80 pounds on Weight Watchers. I realized that it would take more than a prescription to lose weight and feel good on a GLP-1.
Better results, expert support, lose more weight, make it last.
I can't imagine doing a GLP-1 without Weight Watchers.
Get started for as low as $25 at weightwatchers.com/GLP1. For over 60 years, we've helped millions of members find what works for them. Now, it's your turn. Weight Watchers. Watch it work.
This is episode 401 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Laurie Johnson, Professor of English and Cultural Studies at the University of Southern Queensland, Australia. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Merry Christmas! It's a wonderful holiday season, and this year we are getting to take a trip back into the life of William Shakespeare to explore one of the most extravagant Christmas celebrations of Shakespeare's lifetime. It's the Christmas of 1603. This is when the newly crowned James I hosted his first royal festivities as King of England. The court was alive with feasting, pageantry, and opulent merrymaking. It was a moment of political transition, and James made sure his first Christmas made a powerful impression. The newly renamed King's Men, Shakespeare's company, performed for this court, securing their new royal patronage. Alongside these performances were dazzling masques, intricate entertainments, and diplomatic displays designed to cement James's image as both a unifier and a sovereign of grandeur. This week, our guide through the glittering halls of Hampton Court in the winter of 1603 is Martin Wiggins, Senior Research Fellow at the Shakespeare Institute, Stratford Upon Avon, author of British Drama, 1533 to 1642, and president of the Malone Society, which is the principal scholarly organization supporting work on early English drama. Martin's objective as a scholar is to make more accessible the full range of drama written and performed in the early modern period, which includes understanding its political, commercial, and cultural connotations. He is the author of multiple works, including Drama and the Transfer of Power in Renaissance England, which includes a detailed look at this very Christmas season. In his current work on the King's Men and their personnel, he's uncovered new insights into how these court performances reflected the broader cultural and political transition from Elizabeth to James. Today, Martin joins us to share what made this holiday season so historically important, how theater helped James define his kingship, and what the royal court's festivities can teach us about Shakespeare's world. Stay with me. We're about to unwrap a Christmas filled with drama, diplomacy, and theatrical delight. Before we dive into today's conversation, remember that you can follow along with the history we're discussing today with our detailed show notes. This is a bonus set of visual content available for patrons of That Shakespeare Life, and it coordinates with what you're listening to. This week's detailed show notes include a portrait gallery of the key players at this celebration, some photographs from Martin of the 1603 and 1604 court performance space there at Hampton Court Palace, along with the list of the plays that were performed this year and what order that all happened in. There are tons of extras to unpack about how the King's Men staged their Christmas revels, all packed into the extras. You can explore all these things while you listen to the show by clicking Access the Extras on our episode page at CassidyCash.com/episode 401. That's CassidyCash.com/EP401. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Martin. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Cassidy, thank you for having me, and Merry Christmas to everyone.
It is a wonderful Christmas season indeed, and we're excited to be stepping into the world of King James and to find out what Christmas would have been like in 1603. Explain for us what it would have looked like and how would it have felt different from the Christmas celebrations our listeners will be having this year, and how does that differ from the more familiar Victorian traditions even?
Yes, you're right. Many of the traditions that we associate with Christmas today were Victorian inventions, notably the Christmas tree. If we go back to the 17th century, Christmas wasn't quite the family-centered occasion of the kind you encounter in, say, Dickens. In 1603, the new royal family didn't come together in its entirety. Yes, the king was there, the queen was there, their elder son, Prince Henry, was there, but the two younger children were far away in the custody of their governors. 7-year-old Lady Elizabeth was at Combe Abbey in Warwickshire. 3-year-old Prince Charles was still in Scotland. In Jacobean times, they did have Father Christmas. He was an allegorical personification of the festival. He wasn't the Father Christmas that we know. When he appeared in A Court Masque by Ben Jonson in 1617, we've got a description of him. He was an old man with a long, thin beard, dressed in round hose, long stockings with cross garters, white shoes, a close-fitting doublet, and a high-crowned hat with a brooch. He probably looked a bit old-fashioned, a bit 16th century, but he certainly wasn't Santa Claus. They did have some Christmas traditions that we'd recognize today. Carol singers would go from door to door with seasonal songs, not necessarily religious ones. There was feasting, but the menu was more likely to be beef or pork than turkey. Another seasonal delicacy we still have was mince pies. There would have been music and dancing. The 9-year-old Prince Henry was tossed from hand to hand like a tennis ball. And people would also entertain themselves with card games. If anything, it was even more of a blowout than it is now, because during Advent, they fasted. A far cry from the modern Advent calendar with a piece of chocolate every day. And it went on for a lot longer. Christmas Day itself was the solemn religious festival. And then the festivities proper started on St. Stephen's Day, the 26th of December, and they continued intensively until 12th night, the 6th of January. You might get a gift on New Year's Day, 1st of January. You wouldn't get one on the 25th of December. And the Christmas season only finally came to an end after 40 days. On the 2nd of February, the Feast of Candlemas, which in some years would coincide with Shrovetide, the second major seasonal blowout before Lent. Although because Easter was a movable feast, it could also be up to a month later. In 1604, Shrovetide was just under 3 weeks after Candlemas. It's the 19th to the 21st of February.
You've said that the celebrations were much more extended and complex than we might imagine today, but how far in advance did preparations begin for these celebrations? And what role did the Revels office play in planning and organizing the Christmas season?
Well, everyone who's interested in Shakespeare knows about the Revels office, but we think of it in terms of its secondary function of censorship and licensing plays, but primarily it was a court department that was responsible for organizing the seasonal revels. And these weren't just a Christmas celebration. They were also a series of events that had big international and diplomatic significance. The master of the revels, Edmund Silney, had to select the plays that were going to be performed. He supervised the rehearsals. He arranged for the provision of extra lighting in the room where the performances were to take place, which meant installing what they called branches, metal chandeliers. There was always a generous helping of professional drama on offer as a court Christmas. The last Elizabethan court Christmas, the year before the one we're thinking about today, featured 7 or 8 plays by 4 or 5 different companies. But the new Stuart court wanted there to be more than usual. Wild rumours circulated to the effect that there were going to be as many as 30 plays. Well, maybe that was just a mishearing, because in the event it was 13, 6 attended by the King, the others by Prince Henry, and fully 7 of them performed by the King's men, newly brought under royal patronage. Now, the work of the Revels office towards these celebrations traditionally started on All Saints' Day, which was the 1st of November. But in 1603, they started a day early on the 31st of October. It might just have been for convenience. It was the start of the working week. It was a Monday. Or maybe it was because there was going to be a bit more to do than in previous years. They got a budget for the job. It was £100, roughly £32,000 at modern value. And this covered the salaries of the 8 members of Revels office staff and the general running of the office, but it didn't include the fees for the acting companies, which were paid from a different account. The actual cost of the job, though, came to £166, 9 shillings and 10 pence, or in modern money, around £54,000. And that was primarily because the money that was paid up front was an underestimate, but also because there were some unusual. This year's Christmas festivities weren't being held as usual at Whitehall Palace, but at Hampton Court outside London. And there wasn't enough room at Hampton Court for the office to do all of its preparatory work. So they had to rent rooms at Kingston upon Thames, 2 miles away. So why was the king staying out of London? Because there had been a serious plague epidemic since May. It had already caused the coronation in late July to be held with the bare minimum of pomp and circumstance. And that also meant that the theatres in London hadn't been operational for public health reasons for most of the year. They closed on the 19th of March as the mark of respect for the Queen's mortal illness. They were expected to reopen in May, but it didn't happen because the plague struck. So in 1603, the theatre companies in London were active for just 11 weeks out of 52. And that both simplified and complicated the Revels office's job of selecting the plays for the court season. Because when theatre companies aren't performing, they cut back on their procurement of new repertoire. In normal times, the play would be introduced roughly every 2 to 3 weeks. So it was going to be difficult for the King's men to come up with 7 after only 11 weeks of playing. Of course, they didn't completely shut down their literary operations because sooner or later they were going to need fresh plays, even though the cessation of commercial performances interfered with the cash flow, which was how they were going to pay the writers. Their own in-house actor dramatist was preparing a new play, which specifically reflected the interests of the company's new patron, the King. There was also a tragedy that Ben Jonson had been working on for 2 years, and which finally got its finishing touches probably in October. So along with the plays that were already in the active repertory in the early months of the year, they just about managed to field the 7 plays that were required of them. It was easier for their competitors because they were lower in the pecking order. The prince's men only had to come up with 3 plays. The queen's men only needed 2. But this wasn't a season that could be chosen, could be shaped to reflect any particular topic or issue in the plays. And they're also for manoeuvre if anything were to go wrong.
Did everything in that 1603 and 1604 schedule go according to plan, or were there surprises that might have reshaped the festivities?
No, it didn't go according to plan. We're talking about the preparations that went on in the month of mainly November. And at the end of that month, the King's men were staying in Mortlake, which is a village around 11 miles away from the Globe. They may all have been crammed into a house owned by one of the senior actors, Augustine Phillips. Some of them may have been boarded out in other lodgings. And no doubt one reason for their being in Mortlake was the same as the King's reason for being at Hampton Court, to avoid the plague. But the King's being at Hampton Court was probably itself another relevant factor. The village was 8 miles from the palace and 6 miles from Kingston, where the Revels office was temporarily based, and where they would no doubt be summoned for the formal rehearsals to be overseen by Edmund Tillman. Now, at the end of November, a message arrived for them at Mortlake, which threw a spanner into the works of the carefully planned Christmas schedule. At that moment, the King was staying at Wilton House with the newly appointed Lord Chamberlain, the Earl of Pembroke. He'd been there for just over a month. And he wanted to see a play by his own acting company, of course, which was more than 3 weeks before their scheduled court debut on St. Stephen's Day. The company found itself having to travel the 84 miles to Wilton and having to decide what to present that would make the best first impression on their patron. Well, what would you present? It will surely have to be the best play they have available, written by their best playwright. In fact, it would have to be the play that was originally scheduled for the 26th of December at Hampton Court. And that play was Measure for Measure, the one that Shakespeare had been tailoring to James's known interest in the philosophy and practice of government. And the performance duly took place on the 2nd of December, and we'll discover later there's reason to think that the king enjoyed it. Though that wasn't the universal reaction, his cousin Arabella Stuart was also there. She said it was, and I quote, ridiculous. Anyway, the King's men were paid handsomely for their trouble. They got £30, just under £10,000 per day. That was 3 times what they were usually paid for a court performance for the king. But they went back to Mortlake with a problem. They'd used up one of their 7 plays, but they still had 7 slots to fill. Now, we know what they did because we know what they performed on the 2nd of February, Candlemas, exactly 2 months after the Wilton House performance. It was a play called The Fair Maid of Bristol, a comedy that is heavily derivative of Shakespeare and most significantly includes a careful retread of the climactic moment of Measure for Measure, where the friar's hood is pulled off to reveal his true identity. This is a play that simply didn't exist and couldn't have existed before Measure for Measure. And it can only have been created by someone who knew Measure for Measure before it had been publicly performed at the Globe. In other words, the King's men came up with their 7th play by having a new one written at speed to fill the last slot of the court Christmas season. And it's almost certain that the writer was the actor who played Pompey, the company clown Robert Armin, who was also the only other senior member of the company known to have written plays. Everything else they had scheduled would have been bumped up a slot or maybe even more radically rearranged. What that means is that on the first 3 days of the court Christmas, 26th, 27th and 28th of December, the plays they presented to the king would have included the new Ben Jonson tragedy, Sir Janus, and probably the folksy comedy, The Merry Devil of Edmonton, which is one of the plays that had premiered at the Globe earlier in the year and proved to be a big hit with popular audiences, but may not have gone down quite so well at court. And we also know from an eyewitness, the courtier Dudley Carlton, that the play on New Year's Day was about robbing Goodfellow. It may have been an otherwise unknown play about the mischievous sprite, but it may also have been a revival of The Midsummer Night's Dream. The company's personnel had turned over quite a lot since that play was written in 1595. 3 of the original leading actors had gone. All of the apprentices had moved onwards or upwards. But they could still have mounted the play with the personnel establishment they had in 1603.
Well, you're mentioning that they would have had the personnel available to reprise Midsummer Night's Dream with who they had there. And so that would be, the Robin Goodfellow play might have been a reprisal of that. Tell us more about what their personnel was. What was their available repertoire to pull from for this season?
Okay, well, Shakespeare always had to write his plays for the specific actors who were going to perform them. So the construction of every individual play records a particular moment in the history and development of the company. And in the case of Measure for Measure, there were 3 actors who were the focus of unusual search. One of them was Alexander Cook. He was coming up to his 20th birthday in the run-up to the Christmas revels. He'd been baptized on the 13th of December, 1583. And his situation was something the company would have been anticipating since the 26th of January 1597, the date on which he was bound as an apprentice to the senior actor John Hemming for a term of 7 years. So he was coming to the end of his apprenticeship, his period of training. This was the point at which he would either leave the company or become a permanent junior member. This was something that happened periodically, roughly every 18 months, 2 years, as apprentices came up through the system. And each time it meant that Shakespeare needed to write a particularly challenging part that would serve as, in effect, the apprentice's final examination, what was called in the terminology of 17th century apprenticeship his masterpiece. Hence the recurrence at intervals of big female roles like Juliet, Portia in The Merchant of Venice, Beatrice, Rosalind, Viola, or later Helena in All's Well That Ends Well, Cleopatra, or Imogen. In Measure for Measure, the demanding graduation role is Isabella. She's the second largest role in the play. And the fact that Cook stayed with the company indicates that he must have done well in that role. In fact, there are a few scraps of evidence from the ensuing years that suggest he was a particularly noted actor in court circles. So maybe he was a pretty young man who caught the king's eye. But of course, that was in the future. Someone else who already had the king's eye was an actor who was almost completely unknown to the London theatre world. When the company that became the King's Men was originally formed in the spring of 1594, the owners and shareholders were 8 leading actors, and this is reflected in the usual role structure of Shakespeare's plays during this period. There are almost always 8 major parts for adult performers, occasionally 7 if someone was having the afternoon off. But when they got their first royal passes on the 19th of May, 1603, there were 9 names on the list, and the very first one was the one nobody's heard of, Lawrence Fletcher. He had been a leading actor in Scotland since the 1590s. He was someone the king evidently liked a lot. In 1595, somebody repeated a rumour that Fletcher, the actor, had been hanged, which James didn't take very seriously, and he jocularly threatened reprisals if it were true. Evidently, Lawrence Fletcher was the king's favourite actor, and the price of becoming the King's Men was for the company to take in or have imposed upon them this new colleague. And that set Shakespeare another problem in writing Measure for Measure. The striking thing about how Shakespeare's plays develop in the Jacobean period is that he keeps on writing for 8 principal actors in a way that consistently suits specific acting personality. And this changes, the role strings, if you like, change at moments that coincide with identifiable personnel terms. In other words, his writing practices don't change to accommodate the new enlarged shareholder base with Lawrence Fletcher as a ninth actor. Or at least they don't change in the way you might expect, because Measure for Measure sees the arrival of a new type of character whose apparent prominence is far in excess of his actual importance. If you look at the characters of Measure for Measure, there's a weird non-speaking part called Varius, who accompanies the Duke of Vienna in the closing stages of the play, but has nothing at all to say or do, even though he's presented as a named individual. And later on, there are comparable examples, this time with lines, in, say, Curran in King Lear, or Angus in Macbeth, or Titus Lasius in Coriolanus. Now, if a provincial actor of uncertain ability had been parachuted into the company by royal decree, and if his new colleagues had relatively little opportunity to see how good or bad he was, or what he could do as actor, but nevertheless had to include him in the performance because of the king's known predilection, then writing in a lay figure like Varius might well be the way to make him visible without compromising the integrity of the performance. That's only a hypothesis, but it is a fact that these types of what you might call minor major roles stopped appearing after Coriolanus, and that this was also the point at which Lawrence Fletcher left the company in the most permanent way and in a downward direction. He was buried in September 1608. And there was one other personnel change that Shakespeare had to take into account. It looked as though Augustine Phillips had decided to give up acting at some point in the coming year. In modern terms, he'd given in his notice. That may be why he bought the country house in Mortlake. It was a little too far out for a comfortable commute to work. It'd take about an hour to ride to the Globe at a canter. But it was a suitable place to retire to. It wasn't too far from his established social and professional contacts, but far enough away for him to actually to be retired. And by the end of the year, the King's Men had already engaged his successor, John Lowin, probably initially as a contract actor with the promise of shareholder status when it became available. And Lowin is one of only a few King's Men actors of whom we have a portrait. The problem is, it was painted when he was in his mid-60s, whereas in 1603 he was 27 years old. So you have to look at the portrait and imagine back in time 38 years. And what you ought to be imagining is a big, burly, imposing man, the man who 10 years later played the part of Bosseler in The Duchess of Malfi. We know he was in the cast of Sejanus. He probably played Macro. Shakespeare would also have needed to write something small but distinctive for him in Measure for Measure, and I think that would have been Barnaby, the murderer from Bohemia who refuses to be executed.
What would it have been like to perform at Hampton Court?
Well, the plays were performed in the Great Hall, and that's a space that still exists today, although it's been modified slightly. It was a large room. It measured 106 feet by 40, which was much longer but slightly narrower than the stage at the Globe, which was 27 feet by 43. And the width would have been even more reduced by the fact that the audience would have been seated around the sides of the room. We don't know whether they were more than one deep, but for at least one of the performances on New Year's Day, when they presented the Robin Goodfellow play, the central space would have needed to be as large and as clear as possible because the play was followed by a mask. So the acting area was going to turn into a dance floor later in the evening. Now, there are some photographs of the room in the show notes. You can look up at the magnificent hammer beam ceiling, which you might not have been able to see all that clearly on the night because of the amount of extra lighting that had been installed for the performance. The Revels Office paid nearly £8 to have the lighting branches prepared for the occasion, just over 2,500 in modern money. And both it and the tapestries around the wall, which helped with the installation, would have made the acoustics tricky for the actors because big empty roof spaces tend to eat sound and wall hangings have a dampening effect. Now, if you look one way up the room, you can see the minstrel's gallery, and beneath it there are two entrances that lead into a service corridor. If you turn left, you will quickly be outside in the courtyard and in January in the hole. So that gives the actors two doors from which to enter severally, and they've also got a balcony if they need it, which would be useful in Sejanus, where three spies have to climb up to a hiding place to watch others below. On the other hand, the staging could easily have been adapted to suit the room. That would certainly have been necessary in the Merry Devil of Edmonton because it uses the theatre's curtained central aperture, the discovery space, to be the magician's study. They couldn't have that. It also didn't have any understage area should a trapdoor be required, so we don't know that any of the plays definitely needed one. It's probably significant that Shakespeare deftly wrote Measure for Measure to use as little specialised theatre architecture as possible because he didn't know where the first performances were going to take place, even though the play was going to end up at the Globe. And of course, the very long route meant they were going to have to reorient the performance, in modern terms, change the blocking. A bit like changing an image from landscape to portrait. It's true that most of the audience, seated around the edge of the room, would still be looking at it landscape, albeit both sides. But the most important ones, the royal family, would be at the far end. Another photograph shows the throne end of the hall. It's taken from the minstrel's gallery. In the side wall on the left, there's an entrance that leads into a more private room where the royals would have dined before the show, along with their more intimate courtiers. The biggest problem for the actors and the king alike isn't there anymore in the room, but it has left its shadow behind in the large square on the floor at the upper end, just in front of where the throne would have been. In 1603, that was a hearth. It was the room's principal source of warmth, so it would certainly have been lit in December and January, which meant that King James would have watched the performances through smoke, through flickering flames, and through a shimmer of heat haze. Well, some of the king's men had worked here before, but not for a long time, and not all as members of the same acting company. The last time Hampton Court was used for seasonal revels was 10 years earlier at Christmas 1593-4. This was during another major plague outbreak, and they only had one play, and none of the future king's men were in the cast. But Queen Elizabeth was also there the year before, and there were two plays by Pembroke's men, which included Burbage of Shakespeare, and three by Lord Strang's men, which included John Hemmings, Augustine Phillips, and probably Henry Conroy, an apprentice. So Hampton Court was not in their recent experience, but they will probably have at least some memory of the challenges presented by the space, and especially by that inconvenient part.
If you enjoy learning about the history of William Shakespeare and you want to go one step further to really experience the history for yourself, then consider joining Experience Shakespeare. This premium tier on Patreon lets you go behind the curtain and get hands-on with your history, trying out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare. All of these activities are ones you can complete at home or in your classroom. And as a special bonus for joining our community of history lovers, you also get access to our exclusive library of virtual tours, animated plays, printable history guides, and special discounts on all the items in That Shakespeare Life shop. If you are ready to go beyond just learning and start experience Shakespeare's history for yourself, then join us today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. I'll see you inside. And now, back to the show. Is there any evidence that tells us whether King James enjoyed the performances he saw this season?
Well, there isn't any direct record, but how the king reacted is something that the Revels office paid a lot of attention to. In fact, a later master of the Revels very carefully wrote down each time whether a play was liked or not liked. And this would then affect the selection of the plays for next Christmas. And for 1604, we have a much more informative Revels document that not only notes every play by title, but also gives the names of some of the playwrights. So if we treat that 1604-5 court season as a reflection of what the king did and didn't like the year before, then we can draw some inferences, including from what wasn't chosen from the active repertoire. It looks as if he didn't much like The Merry Devil of Edmund, because in 1604, the company had another one available by the same author. It was The London Prodigal. And it was pointedly not on the court schedule. Even when a little way into January 1605, they were asked for an extra play and said they'd run out. They had nothing new to offer, and they'd have to present something from the back catalogue instead, which incidentally was Love's Law. On the other hand, the king obviously did like the plays by Shakespeare and Johnson, because they are the authors who dominate the King's Men's offerings the following year. And he liked Measure for Measure in particular enough for it to have another performance, its first performance in front of the full court, in pole position on the 26th of December, which was the spot it should have occupied the year before. And there's one other thing we can say with some confidence, which is that he didn't draw any direct parallels between characters in the plays and himself. Now, you might think that Measure for Measure was sailing close to the wind, in view of the fact that King James and the Duke of Vienna share a dislike of crowds. But there is some reason to think that the play was censored to remove a very minor detail that might have encouraged a direct political analogy, without which all you have is a personal preference that James probably thought was just normal, as we all do with our own individual idiosyncrasy. You might also think that Sejanus wasn't an altogether happy choice, given that it's about a reclusive emperor who imposes his will on a discontented populace, partly through treason trials, which have some striking parallels with the English trials that took place in September and led to the downfall of Sir Walter Raleigh, among other prominent Elizabethans. But it's an insecure ruler who finds unflattering parallels. The new Jacobeans might just as well have seen Sejanus and breathed a sigh of relief that they were not living under the rule of a depraved tyrant like Tiberius in the play. In fact, that the play set off by contrast the benignity of their own king.
Well, the plays may have been edited somewhat to remove those minor details that could have drawn direct parallels and apparently contained relatively little political content directly. The masques of the season, they, however, addressed politics much more directly. What were these masques like in 1603, and what political messages were conveyed through the king's hastily arranged Twelfth Night masque and then the Queen's masque?
Well, the first thing to remember is simply that there were. The English court hadn't had masques at Christmas for 20 years. Some people thought it was, in modern terms, weird. Others were struck by the extravagance. The court gossip in the run-up to Christmas was that the Queen's masque was going to cost £100,000, or in modern money, 32 million. And part of the action of the King's masque involved James being symbolically presented with a New Year's gift that he'd actually paid for himself, a jewel that cost, it was said, £40,000. Well, in reality, the productions didn't cost anything like that much. We don't have the complete expenses for either art, but the bills we do have for the Queen's masque add up, if my sums are right, to £953, 14 shillings and 8 pence. In modern terms, about 310,000. And we also have the jeweller's bill for the allegedly £40,000 gemstone gift. What it actually cost was £760, modern equivalent to around £250,000. So yes, the masks were still expensive, but the sums involved weren't quite as fabulous as some people thought. And I'm going into detail about the money because it was part of the point. King James's court was being lavish in the supply of entertainment. Remember, there weren't only masks, there were also an awful lot of plays, an unusually large number. And that was because this constituted a statement of magnificence and therefore of power by the new regime. Now, if we dig into what actually happened at the masque, we can start to see some lines of specific policy emerging too. The essence of a traditional masque was the arrival of a group of exotic visitors to the court, introduced by a single speaking figure who was known as the trucksman. In the case of the King's Masque, which is performed on New Year's Day, this was a flying Chinese musician who was winched down from heaven, or in real terms, from the minstrel's gallery at the lower end of the hall. He gave what one member of the audience described as a long, sleepy speech, which I think must be sleepy in the sense of sleep-inducing, and no doubt in part because it was long. He introduced some knights he'd brought in a cloud from the Far East to see the magnificency of this court. And the knights then paid their respects to the king and presented him with their heraldic scutcheons and, of course, with that costly jewel. Then they danced with ladies from the audience, after which the magician dissolved his enchantment and revealed that they weren't Oriental knights at all. They were actually courtiers in disguise, which, of course, was something that everybody knew perfectly well to begin with. Now, one important point here was where the knights had come from, or to be precise, the fact that they hadn't all come from the same place. The magician's cloud hadn't flown direct from China with a full complement of passengers. 4 knights set off from there, and then there was a stopover in India to pick up the other 4. And it wasn't a coincidence that in reality they were 4 English and 4 Scottish forces. One of the major unavoidable tensions of the first part of the reign, the early months, arose from the fact that the new royal family arrived with their existing entourage from Scotland. And this meant that although there were more jobs at court, simply because there were now 3 major royals to service instead of just Queen Elizabeth, there was also more competition for those jobs. And there was a lot of resentment, particularly from English hopefuls who felt that their places had been usurped by the newcomers from north of the border. So the choice of the 8 masters was integrating the English with the Scots. They were all dressed more or less alike in their masking costumes, but they were still acknowledged as having different national origins. And this was one of the preconditions for James's long-term political project of uniting the 2 kingdoms to make a new political entity called Great Britain, something that ultimately didn't happen until 1707 during the reign of the last Stuart monarch. The 2 peoples, English and Scots, had to be brought together in amity without compromising their individual cultural identity. And that delicate issue was also the political point of the 12th Night Masque, which seems not to have been part of the original planned programme. Now, this is where we need to think about one of the less comfortable presences at the festivities, the French ambassador, Christophe Harlay, Sieur de Beaumont. He'd been there at Winchester in October when the Queen gave a hastily organised masque to greet Prince Henry on his arrival at court. And he'd been rude about it. He sneered at what he regarded as a cheap, rustic masquerade. Nothing like it as good as you'd get at the French court. Another of the objectives of the King's magnificent masque was to contradict that. Beaumont decided he didn't want to come. He'd rather go to the Queen's masque, which was planned for 12th night. Just before the performance on New Year's Day, he was forcibly escorted to the Great Hall and seated next to James at the throne end. He didn't pay much attention to the show. He spent a lot of it trying to wheedle an invitation for 12th night as well. And eventually the king, in a moment of weakness or distraction, said, all right, he could come. And that created a major problem of protocol. How close to the king you got to sit was an indicator of respect and perceived status. And in the case of ambassadors, this applied to the nations they represented rather than just individuals. And with certain ambassadors from powerful states, you couldn't invite both to the same event because one would have to sit nearer the king than the other, and the one who was further away would report back that he, and so by implication the master back home, had been slighted. And this year, then, the plan was to have the French ambassador at the King's Masque on the 1st of January and the Spanish ambassador at the Queen's on the 6th. Now, the French ambassador had wangled an invitation on 12th night, so there was trouble brewing. So what did they do? They postponed the Queen's Masque by 2 days and arranged something else on 12th night. And Beaumont ended up seeing that. And eventually he had to be flatly told that he wasn't welcome at the Queen's Masque, though it was later rumoured that he came anyway in disguise. But what he saw on the 6th of January was a semi-private and rather rudimentary masque in which the visitors to the court were Scotsmen, who did a recognisably Scottish thing, a sword dance right at the heart of the English court. So again, the masque was addressing in a different way the importance of acknowledging the Scots as a distinct national culture within the projected union that James hoped to achieve. And the same issue was present in a minor key in the Queen's Masque when it went ahead 2 days later, on the 8th of January, with a libretto by her favourite poet, Samuel Daniel. This time the maskers were 12 goddesses, bringing blessings to Britain. One of them was Concordia, the goddess of union, played by the Countess of Nottingham, wearing a party-coloured mantle, crimson and white together in the same garment, which was also decorated with party-coloured roses. She also carried a branch with 2 conjoined roses, one red and the other white. And the point of that, of course, was the same 2-in-1 message of unification. But if the imagery also strikes you as rather Tudor, uniting the red rose with the white, then that's pertinent too, only not quite in the way that you might think. Despite the size of the tradesman's bill, no costumes were newly made for this masque. Instead, garments were selected from Queen Elizabeth's wardrobe in the Tower of London and converted to use in the new film. Presumably one of the things that was found there was a mantle with Tudor roses, which were now given a different spin to the Stuart court. Everyone knew that these were the old Queen's clothes. So there was a sense of both continuity and change here. That was also true in the fact that Queen Anne herself was appearing in the role of Pallas, goddess of wisdom. Normally a masque was something that was presented to a distinguished personage rather than performed by them. Queens might participate in the dancing towards the end, but no royal had actually taken a role in the court theatrical since Edward VI in the 1540s, which I think was just beyond living memory. There was a sense around the early Stuart court that masking was a little bit beneath the Queen's dignity, and this was especially crystallised in what she wore in this masque and how it had been altered, because alone among the goddesses, Pallas wore her skirt short. One member of the audience, who rather obviously wasn't married, was astonished. He later wrote that he never knew women's legs. These were the Virgin Queen's clothes, but worn in a way that she never would. So the masque's ultimate public statement was quite a blunt one. Queen Elizabeth was history. Queen Anne now owned her wardrobe and could do with it what she liked. New Britain enjoyed peace, amity, justice, riches, power, empire, and union, the gifts of the visiting goddesses. But I think the Stuart court's other Christmas message can be summed up most succinctly in some famous words from a much later time in British history in 1945. We are the masters now.
That certainly gives us a sense of how important the lavishness and the sort of over-the-top expectation of these events would have served the purpose of this new royal regime. How exciting to have been in the room to see this moment take place. If we wanted to explore this subject on our own, what are some good places you can suggest that we begin?
Well, I hesitate to recommend my own book, but I have written about this particular court event in Drama and the Transfer of Power in Renaissance England, which studies the political agency of drama at 5 key transitional points in the history of Tudor and early Stuart England, and this is one of them. There's much more information in a less narrative form about everything that was dramatics that was done in the British Isles and written by British authors overseas in this period in my British drama 1533, 1642. You should probably look at original documents. It's sometimes said that scholarship merely entails an author repeating what a previous author has said about a given subject. That's not right. It would be truer to say that that scholars look at original documents and interpret them in different ways sometimes from what has gone before and just dig into the data. So it would be worth looking at original documents like the letter to W. Carleton to John Chamberlain. He wrote a very full account. He was the man who was in the room and who tells us what it was like. All of those letters have been edited, and the details of that are in the show notes. W. Carleton, John Chamberlain, Jacobean letters. The Rebels accounts are available in the Malone Society collection series, volume 13. The accounts, the tailor's bills and whatnot for Queen Anne's masques have also been published in a journal called Medieval Renaissance Drama in England, along with an account from the Spanish ambassador in the journal English Literary Renaissance. And the French ambassador's rather snarky reports are printed in the appendix to Sullivan's Court Master of James I, but they are in 17th century French, if you can read that.
As if secretary hand wasn't difficult enough on its own.
Yes,
These are excellent resources, and Martin has provided an extensive list. If you want to dive into the Christmas season of 1603 and find out, what Christmas was like in the 17th century, there's a lot of additional resources as well as links to the plays that we've been discussing, all in the show notes for today's episode. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Martin, we ask everyone this next question here at That's Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
And also in addition to my 8 gramophone records and luxury item, I suppose. Well, if I'm on a desert island for any length of time, I'm going to need quite a lot of variety. So the book that I would take with me would be, it's quite an old book now, by G.B. Harrison, called The Elizabethan Journal, which he writes as someone who was alive between 1591 and 1603. And he just writes about all the different things that people were talking about. He says he got the idea originally in 1921, when he realized that future historians were going to be writing about the Treaty of Versailles as the major event of 1921, when actually the thing that most people were talking about in England in 1921 was the fact that Charlie Chaplin had come to England. So he wanted to get that kind of on-the-ground sense of all the different things that people were talking about and what was on their horizon. And I think it's a wonderful book of miscellaneous stuff from the last decade or so of Queen Elizabeth's reign. And that would give me the kind of variety.
That sounds fantastic. Now I want to go and read this book. I'm glad you picked that one. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm working on if Shakespeare were physics, you would call it the integrated field theory. How Shakespeare wrote his plays using source material was partly a function of which actors were available to appear in. And the actors who are available to appear in them is in turn partly a function of when the plays were written. So I'm working on a trilogy which will be called The Making of Shakespeare, which will establish the chronology of Shakespeare, which will establish the original cast, the actors for whom Shakespeare was writing. The interesting thing not being that you can put one name against another name, so much as you can say that this role was played by the same actor who played this role, and this role, which will also tie it in with the process of writing the play, of turning a pre-existing narrative into a play. How does Shakespeare actually get from Green's Pandosto and make The Winter's Tale? And when he does it, that's my immediate project. I'm also going to be general editing the collected works of Thomas Dekker.
I think that's a wonderful project to be working on. I can't wait to see what you put together and be able to explore that history, because it's very neat to think about the plays Shakespeare was writing as being a little, bisection of what his life was like in that moment, and exactly who his connections were and what was there, and having that influence how he put the plays together. We'll look very much forward to seeing that come to fruition. Thank you so much, Martin Wiggins, for being here today and sharing with us this trip into Christmas of 1603. It's been really fun to step back into these festivities and explore them with you today.
You're very welcome.
The Christmas season of 1603 wasn't merely a celebration, although it was a giant one of those. It was also a carefully staged performance by James himself to present the power and political transformation he hoped to bring to England. As James I took the English throne, the newly renamed King's Men stepped into the spotlight, bringing Shakespeare's plays into royal favor and helping to shape the image of this new monarch. Many thanks to Martin Wiggins for guiding us through this remarkable moment in history. We have placed links to Martin's work along with all the resources he recommends, along with links to related episodes about Christmas in Shakespeare's lifetime, all on our episode page at CassidyCash.com/episode 401. To explore the full atmosphere of James I's first Christmas in England, including portraits, pictures of Hampton Court, and details on what was performed during the 1603 and 1604 Christmas seasons, be sure to grab the detailed show notes by clicking Access the Extras on CassidyCash.com/episode 401. Again, you can find all of these things at CassidyCash.com/EP401. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. From all of us here at That Shakespeare Life, we wish you warmth and joy this holiday season. Thank you for spending time here with us this year. Until next time, may your plays be festive, your wassail be warm, and your Christmas be full of sparkle and cheer. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.